that gets made, however, is that so the United States is left as this kind of unipolar, it's a unipolar system. It's no longer bipolar. In the 1990s, it was unipolar. There was no country that was even close to challenging the United States. Not even close. China was 15 years away from even coming close after the end of the Cold War. So, you have a situation in which there are no big conflicts. No big armed state-to-state conflicts. Even in the Middle East, when was the last normal, conventional state-to-state conflict between Israel and any of the other countries? When was the last one? When? No, not even close. It was 2006 was Israel versus Hamas versus Hezbollah. Again, non-state actor. 1973. 1973, it was Israel versus Egypt and Syria. Basically, Egypt and Syria. Basically, Lebanon. Israel versus Egypt and Syria. After that, there's been no state-to-state conflict between Israel and any Arab country. There's been, well, exactly, what was the nature of the conflict? That's where things get kind of interesting. It's mostly because the Arab states realized after 73 that there was not going to be a conventional military victory in the World War II style of, tank battles with artillery and soldiers going and taking property. That just wasn't going to happen. There were no normal conventional wars on the European continent. Even Yugoslavia, the war in Yugoslavia wasn't that kind of war. Normal war had ended for the most part. It takes place in Africa in some places, but it's mostly not state-to-state conflict. Those are mostly civil wars. And so what you had is that people started noticing the means of violence were drifting away from states. We're drifting away from states. They were drifting out into society. The means of violence in some ways were becoming democratized. And conflict was becoming what was called asymmetric. That is, the United States, with its 11 carrier task forces. I mean, each carrier task force, you have to understand what we're talking about here. These carrier task forces consist of an aircraft carrier and dozens of ships around it. They're in effect, each one of them is like the Death Star in Star Wars. They can each take out countries with zero problem whatsoever. The question isn't whether they can do it, it's only whether they will do it. So you have a situation in which no country is actually going to attack the United States as a country directly. That's a suicide mission. A suicide mission. Well, then things do start to get more interesting here. Because the nature of violence becomes asymmetric in that you have people who are willing to give up their own lives to attack those who are not necessarily even combatants. In a shopping mall, at an airport, in a line for an airplane, wherever. And what can you use to get back at them? Your aircraft carriers, your nuclear weapons, your tanks, your Aegis missile destroyers. What are you going to do? How will this work? Where does the conflict come from? It's not coming from states. On 9/11, Afghanistan did not attack the United States. Iraq did not attack the United States. What attacked the United States? Al-Qaeda. What's Al-Qaeda? It's a kind of a network. It's a bunch of guys. And that's where we get into Hezbollah. It's the same thing. It's a network. It's a bunch of guys with a few trucks, a few weapons launchers. They watch a little television, they go out, they launch a few weapons, they go back inside, Right? It's not a normal state with a normal chain of command. And so the question became, how do you deal with this? Where does this come from? Could realism even help us understand how to deal with it? The Soviet Union, we understood. The Soviet Union was clear. You either attack them or destroy them, or the normal strategy became throughout all of the Cold War period was one of containment. You surround them with the aircraft carriers, you point your nuclear weapons at them, and you keep them boxed up. So you get to run Eastern Europe, eventually they'll kick you up and get sick of you. In the meantime, we're going to box you up. How does containment work for Al-Qaeda? What do you do? Where do you deter? Where do you surround with the nuclear weapons? Where do you send the aircraft carriers? In short, realism doesn't get you very far. And it's out of this idea that eventually you get the seeds of what becomes neoconservatism. What does neoconservatism say? It says A, realism won't get you very far. B, the problem, what produces the kind of terrorism that occurred in 2001, what produced that terrorism is a specific problem internal to parts of the Arab Muslim world. A specific problem. It's not a completely unfamiliar problem, they are. It's one we've seen before. These are countries that are on the cusp of modernization. They're on the cusp of modernization. And that part of the world has gone through a kind of a protracted modernization crisis that's lasted since the 19th century. And if you read the Bernard Lewis article, it's exactly what he says. He's an expert on Turkey. He argued that they found themselves behind economically. This is Turkey in the 19th century, Ottoman Turkey. They felt themselves behind the West. They tried to catch up economically, they tried to catch up politically, and it kind of all failed. And the same thing was happening in the Arab world, that they had very poor levels of economic development, that nowhere did they have a democracy, and that you had all of the kind of cultural struggles between ethnic minorities and majorities, about women's emancipation, about inclusion in politics, about democracy, all of those kinds of struggles that made some countries in Europe dangerous in the 19th and early 20th century. The Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. Countries that themselves were on the cusp of modernization when they grabbed onto these totalitarian ideologies in search of avoiding the last throes of modernization. And it's out of that crisis that if you wanted to look for the sources of 9/11, you needed them. You did not look inside of Lower Manhattan. You wouldn't find it there. You had to look in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in Egypt, in Iraq. And that becomes the source of the analysis. Where does this come from? Okay, so if that's the analysis, what's the solution? Well, normally what you would do for a dangerous country or a dangerous area, according to a realist, you would surround it, you would contain it, you would quarantine it. But the neocons argue that that won't work. It's not a country. You can't contain it that way. The world's globalized. People move around everywhere. This is not a matter of a state attacking us. These are societies attacking us. So what's the solution? Well, of course, the more clever among you have already figured out what their solution was. The solution is you have to change the society. You have to get them through this really horrible modernization crisis. And that can only be done from the outside, with the military. You have to topple these unelected leaders, allow the modern elements of society from below to rise up and take over. And in that way, you'll solve the problem. I'm giving you the best possible spin, just like I did with realism. has nothing to do with the realists. We're going to gasp when they heard this. The realists said, oh my Lord, this is the stupidest idea I've ever heard. So one realist I said, so you say, okay, so let me get this straight. You're going to go into Iraq, you're going to invade Iraq, you're going to unseat this Saddam Hussein, you're going to declare democracy, there's going to be a parliament, and everything's going to be fine. You said, yeah, that's the basic idea. And then he said back, he looked into the audience, it's a big audience, and he said, how many people here are married to their first cousin? And nobody put their hand. It's standard in California, married their first cousin. Right? And he said, in Iraq, half of people marry their first cousin. Now, he's not making a biological point. He's making a point about the nature of the society. That you're going to just topple Saddam Hussein and then create a democracy in a modern society. You're going to get them through their modernization crisis by getting rid of their dictator. Their modernization crisis is the dictator is the tiny little tip of that iceberg. You're going to have to stay a long, long time to go back to your question. This is a kid-based society in which people don't care very much about the nation state, in which they care mostly about their group, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is their different stage, a different stage of socioeconomic development. It will probably change over time, but there's nothing we're going to do by invading. The neocons then came back and said, we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, there's going to be more 9/11s, because that's where 9/11 comes from. 9/11 comes from the nature of those societies, and we can't do anything about it. We're stuck with it. That is the neocon analysis. The neocon analysis is in many ways, it's an analysis that talks about modernization. And I think that what I assigned you the Bernard Lewis article because he's a very, very powerful thinker. He's not a dummy. He's really not. He's quite respected in the Arab world. He's very respected in Turkey. He's deeply criticized by a lot of people, right? Not that surprising if you read the analysis. Some people said that some people come into the world, he said it was insulting to Arab countries. I think he was insulting to Arab dictatorships. I'm not sure he was insulting to Arab people. And the analysis is absolutely fascinating because it gets you all the way to the point when I just kind of took you through. And then he says at the very end, and therefore, remember it's written in November 2001. November, like a month and a half after 9/11, he says, and therefore, we need to invade Iraq. Right, which won't come for another 2 years after that. So I think it's a very important document in understanding the intellectual origins of American neoconservatism, which in some ways, I want to argue, plays to the most kind of idealistic spirit within the American psyche. That is the idea, everybody wants to be democratic, everybody wants to be modern, everybody wants to have self-determination, and hell, if we give it to them at the bottom of a gun, that's just a gift. They should accept it as such. Now, we all know that the Iraqis didn't take the deal. They didn't take the deal. But that was the deal. What am I to say? My point is a simple one. My point is a simple one. Modern terrorism, of which I've given you this one case of Osama and Al-Qaeda, it's not the only one. It really is a situation in which the security dilemma has completely changed. It is no longer state versus state. Realism appears not to be able to handle it in any normal way. It is about society. It's about the innards, which the realists don't care about, remember. The realists don't care about what goes on inside of societies. But the nature of modern terrorism is that's what it's all about. And so, if the neoconservative path is not the right one, and I'm not up here to defend any of it at all. But you would agree that the nature of modern terrorism comes as a result of things internal to these societies. Well, then the question is, what's the answer? The neoconservative posed what? Conservative posed what? Obviously things haven't quite worked out as they thought they would. That was one. So that's number one. End of the Cold War. States no longer the source of security dilemma. Society's source of security dilemma produces a response which says that we don't necessarily contain states we don't like, but we transform societies we don't like.